You have to imagine a ship so powerful it could bring an entire nation to its knees. For me, the Bismarck was the Death Star.
The underwater drone steadied itself in the black Atlantic water as a vast shadow rose out of the gloom. At first, the cameras showed only scattered snowfalls of silt and the occasional flicker of a deep sea fish. Then a curve of steel emerged, followed by the unmistakable outline of a massive gun turret lying twisted on the seabed. Those watching in the control room knew the shape by heart from grainy archive photos and artist impressions. This was the Bismarck at last, not as a distant myth, but as a real structure filling the screen from edge to edge. As the drone drifted closer, its thrusters whispering tiny corrections, the wreck stopped being a legend and became a place. That moment, when the first sharp high-definition images of the hull flowed in, was when conversation died and historians simply stared. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. For decades, the Bismarck had occupied an almost unreal space between history and legend. It had been the pride of a regime that wrapped itself in symbols of power, a ship that seemed to burst into the Second World War narrative fully formed, stalked the North Atlantic, sank the British battlecruiser Hood, and then itself was sent to the bottom after a furious hunt. Many accounts existed, full of maps, survivor testimonies, and battle reports. The position of the wreck had been known for years, but earlier surveys were limited to remote glimpses, partial mosaics, and short passes with older submersibles. They had sketched outlines and confirmed broad theories. This new expedition was different. The drone was part of a generation of autonomous vehicles able to hover with millimetric precision, weave through narrow gaps, and hold a stable gaze long enough to gather data rather than snapshots. For the first time, experts had a chance to walk their eyes slowly along the ship that had haunted archives and lecture halls. The scale of the wreck sank in as the drone made its first survey run along the starboard side. The cameras captured a cliff of steel stretching away into darkness, plates buckled and torn, hull number markings still faintly visible under a layer of life and sediment. Massive anchor chains lay coiled like rusted sculptures across the seabed. Here and there, anemones and thin white crabs claimed the metal, indifferent to the story it held. As the drone adjusted its lights, their beams cut across gashes where shells had blasted through armor that was once advertised as nearly impregnable. Historians had seen diagrams of these hits, diagrams drawn from wartime reports and survivor memories. Seeing the real paths of destruction, the way armor plates had peeled and rivets had sheared, pressed those abstract lines into shocking reality. The first true shock came when the drone eased beneath the stern. For generations, a central debate had revolved around how the Bismarck died. Did British guns and torpedoes deliver the fatal blow, or did the crew succeed in scuttling the vessel to prevent capture? The stern region had always figured in these arguments. Older images had suggested structural failure and perhaps a torpedo strike. Now, high-resolution scanning revealed something else. The drone lights slid across a jagged break where the keel had snapped, then lingered on a set of valves and internal fittings twisted open in a pattern far too deliberate to be dismissed as random failure. Nearby, remnants of machinery for controlled flooding remained in position, intact enough for engineers to understand their configuration. These were not simply torn by chaotic forces. They bore marks of operation at the last moment of the ship life. Damage patterns around them suggested that water had poured in from engineered channels at the same time as external holes allowed the ocean to rush through. The geometry of this flooding told a story of crew actions that matched neither side of the old argument cleanly. The drone operators guided the vehicle along the break line, following paths where later structural collapse had exposed inner spaces. Through openings that once were rooms and passageways, cameras recorded stacks of twisted beams, shattered bulkheads, and collapsed decks. Yet among the destruction there were islands of eerie preservation. In a partially intact corridor, paint still clung to the walls, dull and colorless in the artificial light but recognizable as careful work done in a shipyard long ago. The drone paused at what had clearly been a set of doors leading into an internal compartment. One door had been blown inward, but beyond it shelving remained in place along a wall. On that shelving, half buried in sediment, were objects that could be made out clearly enough to identify: metal tins, a dented mug, what looked like a folded piece of equipment webbing. The mundane nature of these things hit as hard as any dramatic find. They made this legendary warship feel uncomfortably homely, a space where people had lived, worked, eaten, waited. Further forward, as the drone explored a deep fracture in the superstructure, another revelation waited. Navigating through a tangle of cables and collapsed decking, the vehicle emerged into what appeared to be the remains of a control space, possibly part of the central operations area. Tables were overturned and equipment smashed, but on one wall a panel of instruments still clung to its frame. Glass faces were gone, but needles and dials survived in frozen positions. Near them lay a crushed cabinet that had spilled out its contents into a fan across the floor. Among shards of wood and metal lay a scattering of paper, some sheets folded, others splayed flat and pinned by debris. The water and pressure had turned them into fragile, darkened layers, yet some markings remained visible. Not enough to read as continuous text, but enough to show layout, headings, and the disciplined structure of formal orders. Historians realize that these sheets, once protected, deep within the ship were likely related to battle procedures or damage reports that never made it to any archive. Their presence here and the space in which they lay confirmed that the crew had continued to fight and organize despite the storm of fire outside. In another section, the drone passed by a bank of machinery that once powered radar and gunnery control systems. The Bismarck had been built as a showcase of engineering, combining heavy armor with sophisticated sensors and fire control. Many descriptions in technical histories had relied on partial blueprints and captured reports. Now, with patient passes of the drone, high-resolution scans traced every cable run and mounting bracket. One cluster of devices near the base of a mast stump drew particular attention. It did not match any clearly documented layout. The casing had broken open, exposing coils, waveguides, and what looked like an experimental module. Under the layer of corrosion and marine growth, this equipment hinted at an attempt to integrate more advanced detection or jamming systems than previously confirmed. For naval historians who had debated how far German engineers had gone in radar and countermeasures, this single cluster of hardware was enough to require a complete reassessment of what the ship carried to sea. The hull itself told another story as the drone methodically mapped impact zones. Some shell hits that wartime gunnery reports had placed in one area turned out to be elsewhere. Angles of penetration were different from what reconstructions had assumed. A pattern emerged in which several critical hits appeared to have struck at angles made possible only because the ship had already lost steering and was yawing in the waves, presenting unexpected aspects to enemy fire. This subtle geometrical insight altered the understanding of the last hours of the battle. It suggested that fate did not simply deal blows at random, but that the earlier damage which crippled the rudder had cascading effects that exposed new vulnerabilities in armor arrangement. Naval architects watching the feed began to trace back how these angles would translate into internal shockwaves and flooding paths. The Bismarck had always been at the center of debates about battleship design, about the balance between protection, speed, and firepower. Now, the wreck itself provided hard data instead of arguments drawn from theory and incomplete logs. In the forward sections, the drone lights played across one of the massive gun turrets that had been thrown from its barbette and now rested upside down on the seabed. The weight of this single component was immense, yet it lay like an abandoned toy next to the larger mass of the hull. Close up, the guns showed pitting and colonization by sea life, but details remained sharp. The muzzles still carried manufacturing marks. Mechanisms at the breech were frozen mid-motion, caught at some moment in the chaos. This turret, now silent, had once delivered the salvo that destroyed a British capital ship in minutes. Seeing it inert and broken spoke to the transience of power in a way that no lecture or diagram could match. At the same time, engineers studying the footage saw things that no one had described before: how armor around the turret face had delaminated, how joints between plates had failed under combined stress of fire and impact. These details provided a field test of concepts in metallurgy and structural design that had existed only on paper when the ship was built. Perhaps the most haunting images came when the drone ventured into crew areas where collapse had been partial rather than total. In a mess space, benches and tables were crushed but still recognizable. Nearby, a row of hooks along a bulkhead held a few pale outlines where cloth once hung, now long decayed, leaving only patterns in the sediment. On a deck below, a pair of boots lay side by side near a doorway, their leather outlines preserved by silt. There were no human remains, but the arrangement of objects suggested lives interrupted mid-movement. A mug lay overturned with its handle intact, a playing card fused to the floor by mineral deposits, a toolbox open with its contents strewn in a halo. These scenes did not reveal any new tactical data or secret technology, but they shook those who spent their lives parsing casualty lists and personnel records. The ship had become a symbol, either of pride or of hubris depending on perspective. Inside the wreck, what mattered most was the ordinary existence of those who sailed on it, preserved in a moment that had never been meant for anyone to see. The implications of this mission extended far beyond the reconstruction of a single battle. For naval historians, the wreck offered an unparalleled laboratory. Three-dimensional maps created from the drone data allowed them to rotate entire sections of the ship in virtual space, cut through decks, and trace paths of damage from impact to final breach. The Bismarck had been designed at the edge of an era when battleships still dominated naval thought. Now, at rest on the seabed, it could teach lessons not only about its own strengths and weaknesses, but also about the transition to new forms of warfare. Analysts could compare theoretical blast calculations from pre-war design documents with the actual scars on the hull. They could test long-held assumptions about how armor belts interacted with high-velocity shells at oblique angles. They could understand how compartment arrangements influenced survivability once critical systems failed. Every meter of the wreck became a data point in a conversation that linked past design philosophies to present questions about protection and vulnerability at sea. Beyond technical studies, the mission forced a reconsideration of how deep ocean wrecks are treated as historical sources. Traditionally, historians relied heavily on written records, survivor testimony, and official archives. Underwater sites were either inaccessible or too expensive for detailed investigation. This drone mission demonstrated that a ship resting thousands of meters below the surface could serve as a direct primary source, as rich and complex as any bundle of documents. Scrape patterns on the hull, scorch marks inside compartments, even the distribution of loose objects told stories about movement, impact, and human reaction. The camera drifting through silent passageways became a witness to events that had never been fully recorded above the waterline. This raised challenging questions about how many other wrecks held untapped evidence that could confirm, refine, or overturn established narratives of naval battles. There were ethical dimensions as well. The Bismarck is a war grave, a final resting place for many who went down with the ship. The drone navigation through interiors had to balance curiosity with respect. No salvage took place. Nothing was moved beyond the disturbance caused by gentle currents from thrusters. Yet even this non-invasive presence sparked reflection. What does it mean to enter such a space with cameras, to study the objects left behind by those who never left? The mission underlined the need for careful frameworks that treat deep-sea exploration as a form of visitation to a historical site, not a treasure hunt. The images, while invaluable for scholarship, carried a weight that went beyond technical interest. They reminded viewers that every piece of steel, every fractured beam had been part of an environment in which people struggled and made decisions under extreme pressure. On another level, the expedition showed how modern technology can recover nuance that had been lost in the simplifications of popular storytelling. The Bismarck had often been framed in stark terms, as a monster of steel brought low by superior numbers, or as a tragic marvel doomed by strategic missteps. The wreck told a subtler story. Evidence of deliberate scuttling measures operating alongside catastrophic battle damage suggested that the ship end was neither entirely imposed from outside nor entirely controlled from within. The emerging picture was one of overlapping factors, of a crew trying to shape their fate even as hostile fire tore the vessel apart. This kind of complexity resists slogans, but captures the reality of war at sea far more accurately. The drone did not just confirm or debunk single lines in history books, it revealed how many separate threads had been woven together in those final hours. As the drone continued its slow circuit around the wreck, the team gradually shifted from the shock of discovery to the discipline of documentation. The first hours had been filled with exclamations and hurried requests to zoom in here or tilt the cameras there. Now, with the realization that every minute of battery life mattered, the control room settled into a pattern. One operator watched the live feed, another monitored navigation and thrusters, while a third tagged time codes and coordinates. Historians sat just behind them, whispering suggestions when an object or structural feature appeared that aligned with some disputed detail in the existing literature. It was a strange choreography, part scientific survey, part guided tour of a place no one had ever expected to see so clearly. The wreck did not end at the hull. Scattered around the ship lay a vast debris field, a halo of metal and shattered structure that told its own story. As the drone ventured outward, its sonar painted a faint relief of the seabed, revealing mounds and ridges where fragments had landed. The cameras picked out pieces of plating bent into improbable shapes, lengths of pipe that curved like skeletal ribs, and heavy machinery lying at odd angles with no immediate context. A set of massive chain links, far from any anchor housing, suggested that something had torn free with extraordinary force. Tracing these fragments outward drew a map of violence frozen in place, and the pattern of that map hinted at how the ship had broken apart on its descent. One of the most revealing passes came when the vehicle followed a trail of smaller items stretching away from the stern area. At first, the objects looked like generic junk, but closer inspection showed repeated forms: shards of decking, fittings that once held equipment, fragments of railings. The distribution suggested that these pieces had peeled away as water pressure and hydrodynamic forces tore at the ship during its fall. By measuring distance and direction from the main hull, analysts began to infer the rotation and attitude of the Bismarck as it plunged. It appeared that the ship had not simply dropped straight down. Instead, the debris pattern implied a slow roll and yaw, as if the vessel had slumped sideways and twisted, shedding layers as it went. This subtle insight tied into theories about internal flooding and compartment failure that had, until now, relied on mathematical models rather than physical evidence. The drone technological sophistication quickly proved as interesting to some observers as the wreck itself. Unlike older tethered submersibles, this vehicle navigated almost like a spacecraft, relying on inertial sensors, acoustic beacons, and real-time terrain mapping to maintain position in the near-total darkness. Its propellers whispered in measured bursts, compensating for deep currents that could nudge it into contact with jagged metal. On the screens, overlays showed distance to the hull in centimeters, angles of approach, and predicted paths if the thrusters cut out. Engineers in the room watched this telemetry with the same intensity that historians gave to rivet lines and deck fittings. This was not just archaeology, it was a proof of concept for exploring landscapes of wreckage that would have been too risky for earlier technology. Every sweep of the cameras added to a growing archive of images, and that archive quickly grew too large for any person to absorb directly. To cope, the expedition brought along specialists in data processing. As the drone sent back streams of overlapping photographs and depth readings, servers quietly began to weave them into detailed three-dimensional models. Within hours, a rough digital shell of the Bismarck appeared, low in resolution at first, then sharper as more passes filled in the gaps. Historians crowded around another set of displays to spin this model with fingertip gestures, aligning it with old shipyard blueprints and wartime diagrams. The comparison revealed differences that were small in some cases but crucial in others. Certain modifications, likely made during fitting out or early service, had never appeared in official drawings. They only emerged now because the wreck preserved them as they had been, not as they were supposed to be. These discrepancies opened a new line of inquiry into the ship construction and adaptation. Over the years, storms, refits, and lessons learned from early voyages had probably prompted minor alterations to equipment placement, armor junctions, and internal routing of cables and pipes. On paper, such changes might be barely noted. In steel, they could mean the difference between a shell passing through harmlessly or striking an unfortunate concentration of vulnerable components. By matching the wreck's exact state to battle damage, analysts started to see how on the day of its last engagement, the Bismarck carried a configuration slightly different from the idealized version most studies had assumed. It was a reminder that no warship ever goes to sea exactly as drawn on its design boards. Particularly fascinating to the team was the discovery of identification markings on structural components. As the drone slipped under exposed deck beams and along opened frames, cameras revealed stamped numbers and codes still legible beneath marine growth. These marks linked individual parts of the ship back to specific workshops and production batches. For historians of industrial warfare, this was like suddenly finding barcode labels in a long-forgotten factory. Patterns emerged in the placement of these codes, hinting at how different suppliers and shipyard sections had been responsible for particular regions of the hull. In a few places, the arrangement of markings suggested hurried assembly, with mismatched batches meeting at awkward joins. That raised delicate questions about whether wartime pressure had forced compromises in construction that might have influenced the ship's resilience under fire. Inside the control room, the atmosphere oscillated between intense concentration and quiet awe. Those who had spent careers writing about the Bismarck found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. Some of their most carefully argued passages would have to be revised. Yet rather than disappointment, there was a kind of exhilaration in that realization. History thrives on new evidence, and here was an enormous body of it, arriving in real time, line by line, pixel by pixel. At one point, as the drone navigated an open section of upperworks, it passed by the remains of a mounting that had once held range-finding or sighting equipment. The structure was twisted, but its design could still be traced. A historian pointed at the screen and whispered that a long-standing debate about the arrangement of those instruments had just been settled by the shape of that broken frame. An argument spanning decades dissolved in a second, replaced by the clarity of observation. The mission also brought to the surface broader reflections about technology and ideology. The Bismarck embodied extraordinary engineering skill pressed into the service of an aggressive regime. That tension lay at the heart of many conversations among the onlookers. To study the ship's fine details was to admire the craft of designers and workers who had shaped steel into something capable of operating on the edge of human knowledge at the time. At the same moment, it was impossible to forget that this craft had been built to project power and terror across the seas. The wreck, lying silent on the seabed, seemed almost to strip away the banners and slogans that had surrounded it in life, leaving only bare questions about how human societies choose to apply their most advanced knowledge. As images of the ship circulated among those involved in the mission, there were discussions about how best to share the findings with the wider world. The temptation to focus on dramatic visuals was strong. The long hull disappearing into darkness, the shattered superstructure, the ghostly interiors where personal items still lay half buried in silt, all had an undeniable emotional impact. Yet the team understood that context mattered. Without careful framing, the images could easily feed shallow fascination with wrecks as curiosities rather than as complex historical sources. Plans took shape for presenting the data in ways that emphasized analysis as much as spectacle, turning the wreck into a case study not only of a particular battle, but of the process by which evidence from the deep ocean can reshape narratives formed on the surface. The potential influence on naval design study was particularly striking. Modern warships bear little superficial resemblance to their early 20th century predecessors, but they share fundamental concerns about survivability, compartmentalization, and system redundancy. The Bismarck resting on the seafloor offered a rare, full-scale experiment in what happens when theory collides with reality under extreme combat conditions. Engineers who usually worked with simulations and laboratory tests now had the opportunity to verify or challenge their models against the scars on this enormous piece of hardware. How did multi-deck structures respond to repeated heavy impacts? Which seams between thick plates proved weakest? Where did shockwaves travel unpredictably through the skeleton of the ship? The wreck held answers encoded in bent metal and torn welds. The broader field of underwater archaeology gained something more intangible but equally important: a demonstration of how deep wrecks can be approached with a mindset that combines respect, forensic curiosity, and interdisciplinary collaboration. The drone mission to the Bismarck was not a solo adventure, but a carefully coordinated effort involving historians, engineers, data scientists, legal experts, and ethicists. Each brought a different lens through which to interpret what appeared on the screens. A tangle of cable might mean little to a naval historian, but speak volumes to an electrical engineer about how circuits had been routed. A cracked bulkhead might be just another piece of wreckage to some, yet to a structural specialist, it was a signature of specific stress patterns. This interplay turned the ship from a static relic into a multidimensional puzzle that no single discipline could hope to solve alone. Questions of law and ownership threaded through these discussions. The Bismarck lay in international waters, but remained tied by memory and legal convention to the nation that had built and crewed her. The wreck's status as a war grave added another layer, demanding that every action be measured against standards of dignity and commemoration. The very presence of the drone raised issues about the rights and responsibilities of those who have the capability to access such sites. As deep-sea technology becomes more widespread, more and more wrecks once effectively protected by depth alone may come into view. The mission to this ship thus served as an early test case. What kind of conduct at these places is acceptable, and who decides? Even within the immediate circle of the project, views differed on how far exploration should go. Some argued that interior searches should remain limited to avoid crossing an invisible line between investigation and intrusion. Others contended that as long as nothing was removed or disturbed, documenting the state of the wreck was a way of honoring, not violating, the memory of those lost. The images themselves often drove these debates. A corridor choked with twisted metal might seem purely structural, but a small object caught in the corner of a frame could suddenly remind everyone that people had once crowded through that space in the panic of battle and flooding. These moments kept the mission grounded in its human dimension, even as it delved deeper into technical detail. The presence of young researchers among the more seasoned experts gave the expedition a forward-looking energy. Many of them had grown up studying high-resolution images from space telescopes and planetary probes. To them, the idea of exploring an earthly site thousands of meters down with comparable fidelity made perfect sense. They brought with them skills in handling large datasets, machine learning techniques to highlight patterns in the imagery, and an instinctive comfort with turning physical reality into manipulable digital models. Watching them interact with the wreck on their screens, spinning sections, zooming into tiny features, and tagging potential points of interest for later review, it was clear that a new generation of historical research was taking shape before everyone's eyes. One project that emerged almost spontaneously involved recreating the final hours of the Bismarck using the new spatial information. Instead of relying solely on logs and after-action reports, this effort would anchor every stage of the battle in the actual structure of the ship as now seen on the seabed. Where did shells enter? Which compartments lay along their paths? How did the loss of one system cascade into the failure of another? By overlaying known timelines of damage reports onto the physical wreck, the team hoped to produce a more nuanced narrative of the ship's struggle. Not a dramatized reenactment driven by imagination, but a reconstruction constrained by physics and geometry. The drone, by mapping each tear and fracture, had effectively provided a crime scene diagram for an event that occurred in the middle of the ocean, far from any human witness capable of seeing the whole. At several points, the vehicle passed close enough to the hull for cameras to pick up subtle surface textures that surprised even those familiar with ship construction. Tool marks along welds, slight depressions where plates had been hammered into shape, traces of original coatings beneath layers of rust and marine growth all appeared with startling clarity. These were reminders that beneath the imposing abstraction of a battleship lay the handiwork of individuals. Someone had once stood at each of those welds, guiding the arc. Someone had painted those surfaces, checked those seams, tightened those bolts. The wreck preserved not just the drama of its end, but the accumulated labor of its beginning, fossilized in steel. The ocean itself, of course, remained an ever-present character in this unfolding exploration. Outside the narrow cones of the drone lights, darkness pressed close, swallowing even the massive bulk of the ship a short distance away. Fine particles drifted like ash, disturbed by the thrusters and then settling again in slow motion. Now and then, a creature passed across the field of view, briefly illuminated and then gone. Their indifference to the human significance of the wreck underlined how utterly the Bismarck had been absorbed into the deep sea environment. Corrosion and biology were slowly rewriting the ship into the geology of the seabed. This process, measured in decades and centuries, lent urgency to the mission. The details being captured now would not remain visible forever. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the drone reaching the Bismarck wreck discovery? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.